Dear friends and fellow progressives, welcome to Berlin.
So, welcome back. Welcome back to the last block of breakout sessions. Just a quick reminder, in the forum, a Green European Journal is being launched as I speak. And in the boardroom, there is by invitation only, a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the progressive governance. If you are here, then you are here with me and Jen Hassum, who is an executive director of the Broadbent Institute in Canada. And she will come to the stage, and she will be hosting and moderating, actually, the Freedom, Power, and Capitalism session, Enhancing Material Security. I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you, everybody, for deciding to join us today. This is my first time in Berlin, first time engaging with European thinkers, and it's just been such a delight. And thank you for your patience, as I don't know German. So everyone's been really helpful. And yes, that's the question that we're going to be discussing today. And material security is in peril. And we know this from the cost of living crisis, from the housing prices, and social security, and the identities that have been fragmented, people feeling lost and not knowing their place in society. I'm reminded by the thinking of Ellen Mixon Woods, who is the late partner at Broadbent, the institute that I'm from. And she said that freedom and democracy are egalitarian projects and values that are constantly at odds with the unequal outcomes of capitalism. And that is what this head-to-head today will discuss. Thanks for joining us, and I'm going to welcome now to the stage Philippa Sigl-Glöckler, who is the director of the German think tank Dezernat. See, thank you for your patience already. It's the Institute for Macro Finance. And also Grace Blakeney, the journalist, author of Vulture Capitalism, Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization. So please come welcome. Hi, this is going to be such a special panel head-to-head because we have two really brilliant economists. And so we're just going to open up with the theme of the whole conference. And so the first question will go to you, Philippa, which is progressive security. Can we redefine and reclaim as progressives the concept of security while also promoting long-term positive freedoms like economic security and social justice?
I really hope that we never lost the concept because it's pretty key to the whole project. No, I mean, if we are serious about every human being flourishing, about having equal chances in life, then people need security. They need to know that tomorrow is going to be okay, that their economic woes are not going to keep them from, doing what they want to do in life. So we need a pretty firm concept of security that spans all dimensions of life.
Right, and so Grace, how are you going to be engaging with the concept of progressive security?
I think we have a bit of a warped understanding of what security actually is, because when this concept is used and brought up, it tends to be used in the context of, okay, so insecurity is when people we don't like do bad things. So we ignore the atrocities perpetrated by our allies, we ignore the material insecurity experienced by our own populations, and we ignore the mass insecurity that's going to be created by climate breakdown. I mean, just take climate breakdown, for example. That is the single greatest threat to humanity, the single greatest security threat that we face. You don't have to take it from me. This is something that militaries around the world, from in the US to the Department of Defense in the UK, have written reports about, saying climate breakdown is going to be the biggest military, not just security threat that the world faces in the coming years. We recently had a poll of climate scientists, IPCC scientists. 80% anticipated that the world would fail to meet even the 2-degree warming target, which creates a planet, a basically kind of unlivable planet for many, many people. It creates this kind of hothouse Earth scenario that they described as leading to a kind of semi-dystopian future. At the same time, we know that by 2050, even in optimistic scenarios, we're going to have about 1 billion, maybe over 1 billion climate refugees. And at the same time, those threats to the climate are creating food insecurity. They're leading to resource wars, creating conflicts in areas that are both creating refugees and becoming uninhabitable for many people. So the idea that this isn't the biggest threat to our global security, and this isn't the thing that governments are focusing on, and are instead directing resources to funding arms companies and purchasing tons of weapons, and saying we don't have any money left to pay for a green transition. It kind of it really undermines this idea that we do care about security. This focus should be on, decarbonization as much as it should be on the kind of hard security that politicians love talking about, and that kind of security which also just so happens to benefit fossil fuel companies and arms companies.
So we in the room and a lot of the discussion, has talked about some of the narratives of right-wing extremists, authoritarians, and that it's purpose-built to exploit people's inner insecurities, their fears, their fear of their future, their children's futures. And so some dismissals have happened around, well, but if you look at the economic numbers, we're doing well. Look at our strong employment rate. Look at our strong GDP, even some of our programs that we are rolling out. So a question to you, Grace, is, one thing that was interesting in a clip I saw from Mick Lynch, who's a trade unionist in the UK, who pointed out that working class anxieties can also be very material, like things that they see in everyday life, whether it's their schools that are crumbling, lineups and inadequate care at the NHS. There is state failures and this kind of erosion of state power. And so how can we, have a authentic left narrative that isn't just trying to sweep things under the rug?
Yeah, totally. So I think this comes down to two things. And the first is, as you said, that kind of erosion in people's living standards. So, our government, for example, in the UK says we have the highest employment rates in a very long time. We also have the highest rates of child poverty that we've seen in many years. We've had the first government in modern history that's actually presided over a fall in people's living standards. Something like 1/4 of children in the UK live in absolute poverty. And you might think, in Europe, we are, better protected. But actually, we've seen that throughout the cost of living crisis, wages have not kept up with rising prices. And in, Germany, you've had a severe contraction in economic growth. You've had a stagnation in real wages that is only just starting to catch up, even though it's a much better unionized economy. And you've had this long-term decline in investment that has kind of eroded the public sphere, undermined infrastructure, and kind of denigrated the commons. It's kind of degraded, the commons, the things that we all rely upon. And that's definitely, I think, had an impact. But I think the bigger challenge is much broader. And it comes down to this issue that we saw, actually, I think, in the most recent European elections, which is that people are very angry. That's right. And they are angry in part about, the erosion of their living standards, but they're also very angry because they feel powerless. If you speak to people who are kind of mobilized by the far right, they will talk about kind of abstract elites kind of taking over the world. There's all this stuff about the World Economic Forum kind of dominating everything. There's this vague sense that there are people out there that are making decisions on everyone else's behalf, and that the promise of democracy hasn't been fulfilled. This was not just the case in the recent elections, it was the case in the Brexit referendum, it's the case in the US with Donald Trump. And there is some legitimacy to that view. You know, you talked about Ellen Mieskens-Wood, who's a brilliant Marxist and theorist of democracy. And she very clearly saw the fact that capitalism is associated with the erosion, not just the erosion of democracy, but the corruption of democracy. You know, you said the state has shrunk and that has created problems. The state hasn't shrunk for everyone. It's very big for corporations that need bailouts. It was very big during the pandemic when you needed kind of mass support for financial markets. It's very big when workers go on strike. It's very small if you need to use health services or welfare. So it's not just the fact that we have a small state that isn't doing anything for anyone. It's the fact that many of our social, political, and economic institutions have effectively been corrupted. They've been taken over by vested interests. And even when the state does expand and you see an increase in state spending, like you saw over the course of the pandemic, that spending is directed to protecting those very same vested interests. It's the same reason we haven't had any action on climate breakdown, because most governments are more interested in protecting those vested interests than they are in actually doing anything about climate breakdown. So we need a third force. We need to really, and you know, the promise of democracy was what Mieskens-Wood wrote about so much. It was like, she said actually at one point,
I'm so happy that you're really engaging with it. She's
one of my favorite Marxist theorists.
Shout her out.
I quote her a lot in my book. And she says at this point, democracy is synonymous with socialism.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with your perspective is I think it's quite shaped by the Anglophone world. I mean, when I lived in the UK and the US, I think, you know, it looked pretty similar, and you can really see this elite story. And also, I mean, just as a matter of fact, there's a lot of money in politics, right? I mean,
yes.
In the US, it's really kind of a revolving door. And then I came back to Europe, and I mean, you know, you have that template in your head, and you think, okay, well, this is the same template that I'm going to fit onto Germany. And when you look at the situation a bit closer, you're really not that sure anymore that this is the case. German politics is a little bit different. I mean, you know, wouldn't want to get into the, is it structurally at the very high level? I think you have a point that, you know, state corporations have a lot of power, can express it well. That there's a common theme here, but I think what stands in the way today is not that politics is so removed and in bed with money that they don't see normal people, and this is the primary problem. We have a lot stupider problems. Like, people are not even annoyed by just politicians being up there and being fancy. They're annoyed by the roads being broken down, the schools not functioning, the train. I think anybody who came here by train has probably experienced the state of our train system, by all these really basic public infrastructure issues. And people can't understand why that is, especially when you're a very, very rich country like Germany. It's very, very hard to explain. So I actually think it's interesting because we have a slightly different kind of problem. The state or politics has managed to somehow give away agency and people don't believe that they have it anymore to solve the problem, to address them. But that's not because they've given it away to the capitalists. It's because they've somehow tied their hands, and it's very hard to see and understand why that is.
Can I very quickly respond? Because I think it's a really interesting point. The last time I was here in Germany, I was told by a very reliable source that in Germany we don't have capitalism, we have the social market economy, which is something entirely different. And I didn't go and lecture them about the basis of Marxist theory, but I thought that was a very interesting point. Because, you know, I think obviously politics everywhere is different, and in Germany things are certainly different than they are in the UK. You know, in the UK and the US and Canada as well, we have this highly developed model of competitive individualism, and we've seen the kind of complete destruction of many of our collective movements in a way that isn't, I think, familiar in European politics. But I know that some of the problems are similar, because if you speak to people and you look at some of the issues that are driving the rise of the far right, for example, this backlash against the green agenda is super interesting, right? Because people are, you know, saying in many parts of the country, I'm getting poorer, and it's because we're fighting a war in Ukraine and because the Greens have taken over control, right? And it's piecing together all these issues from all these different sides of the political spectrum in a way that looks really confusing and nonsensical. You're pro-Russia, anti-green, but you want more investment, and, you know, all these issues don't really fit together. And when you actually look at those issues, they are all driven by this sense of anger at elites, which I think is true across Europe and across the UK and the US, and in a way, this sense of powerlessness. And I do agree with you that, the big problems in Germany have to do with the fact that you have just decided point blank not to invest anything in the public. The public sector's just decided we're not going to do any investment because Schwarz are null, and that's really important for some reason that nobody actually seems to understand. But there's a reason for that, and it's embedded within both German politics and also the structure of the European Union, which is about making sure that the state doesn't direct so much support to working people to try and solve these issues, and instead supports the interests of capital.
So just a brief side note, I think some of the positions, especially on the war in Ukraine, have to do with an East-West split, which also, goes a bit beyond the specific topic, but on that one, because I've also written a book, which isn't out yet, and I went in with a slightly similar hypothesis that, it makes perfect sense. We don't only in Germany have the debt brake and the Schwarze Null, so limiting how much debt you can go into every year, but we also have this 60% debt to GDP maximum in Europe. And it's the perfect fit for institutionalizing the ordoliberal state and saying it cannot be bigger. So I was always convinced that it was the German government who went to Europe, or the technocrats, who went to Europe under the radar when no one was looking because they were talking about reunification and whatnot, and imposed this on Europe and then told Germany, because this is what one always does, we've got this rule from Europe, so we have to implement it. It fits so well, and it works perfectly with ordoliberalism. Finally, the absolute truth. The problem is the story isn't true. Germany really didn't care about the 60. No one in Europe thought that the 60 was important. It was basically an arbitrary decision by a minor negotiation group. Like on the side, it was even the deputies of the people who were supposed to negotiate, who didn't want to come up with a number, who didn't think that debt to GDP makes sense, but they were told they can't hand in a white piece of paper and they have to put something on it. They were told it was preliminary, it wouldn't be a set in stone rule. And that's the only reason why they said, okay, we're going to say 60 isn't the stupidest number in the world because it seems to be the average debt to GDP number that people have right now. So it's...
And yet it's become like the foundational element of German politics, right? Because it wasn't just the 60, right? It was after 2008, you had obviously the debt brake that was introduced, and then this really rigid commitment to fiscal austerity, which you can understand in a number of different ways. Obviously, you can say this is just the decisions that were made by technocrats for particular reasons. But, we had austerity in the UK after the financial crisis as well. And austerity in the UK was very overtly just class war. It was basically stripping away services that were relied on by working people and then pumping tons of money into, basically corporate welfare. I think it's less explicit across Europe, but there has been that tinge to it as well. It has been a set of policies that have undermined the labor movement, undermined people's capacity for collective action, undermined investment in public infrastructure, exacerbated the massive gaping regional divides in the bloc, and really worked to kind of discipline people. Austerity is about disciplining people. And in that sense, it does kind of contribute to this shift in the balance of power.
It contributes, it enshrines it, because, we have a structural lack of demand in Germany, so we have a large low-wage sector. But again, when you look at the development of fiscal rules, and you're completely right that there are a couple of rules, and, they've been building up over time, and the debt brake really is the coronation, putting it into the constitution and saying you need to have structural unemployment in your economy. How crazy is that?
And then taking the EU to court for kind of failing, for potentially breaking this debt.
So, you have all these rules, but again, I looked at the dynamics and I was expecting, well, obviously it must have been, the export-driven companies that want a small state that lobby for it. But the moment you get these additional fiscal rules and they kind of pile up, it's not the export-driven economy coming to the finance ministry saying we need this. It's finance ministers who can't stick to the old promise and who want to look austere and who just implement a new rule. And I've spoken to some of them, and I've asked them because, they then keep failing because they can never stick to their rules. So why did you do this? And didn't you run some simulations? And we're like, no, because surely, if we are prudent, then we can make it. how can you know that you're going to make 60% debt to GDP when you have reunification and when you have bankrupt companies from the East? You don't even know what their balance sheets look like.
Not to mention the global economy. The economy is global, and we can't necessarily predict what crises are going to come.
But prudence goes over that. No, but I find this interesting because it's, I think, at the kind of the very structural level, yes, there's something to it because it fits so well with our economic model, and so there are people at the abstract level who, I think, keep promoting it. But the way that we got into these rules that are now, you know, really creating all the damage, and it's going to be really, really bad what we're doing right now. To me, it seems even more tragic. It's not even capitalist interest; it's an accident, and no one is getting over it.
It's really interesting because it's kind of like that idea of fiscal responsibility and prudence just became the common sense. You know, you were saying finance ministers just decided this is what we were going to do because they couldn't imagine anything else. Why? Because they'd all done the same programs at the same universities, run by the same economists, who'd been influenced by the same economists.
They were all lawyers.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, the ordo-liberals especially, yeah. And that, I think, has been a really interesting shift that, you're right, has taken place over a long period of time and isn't necessarily tied explicitly to, you know, overt corruption or lobbying, but which has been part of a much broader ideological shift associated with, you know, neoliberalism. But I think what's really interesting about neoliberalism, and you see this everywhere, is the lie that underpins it. And it's the, you know, in the 80s, we were promised free markets and democracy. You know, here, in a very real way, the promise was freedom and democracy. And yet we haven't ended up with freedom and democracy. We've ended up with monopoly and oligarchy. And, you know, that's true in the US in a very obvious way, but it's also true in Europe. You know, you've seen a massive increase in market power, and that's often been something that's been encouraged by European institutions. And I think that the breaking of that promise of prosperity, of democracy and freedom that capitalism was supposed to create, I think that's created anger and disillusionment everywhere. But it must have created a huge amount of anger and disillusionment here. And there's obviously still big divides between different parts of the country for people saying, we were promised capitalism, we were promised freedom, we were promised prosperity, and instead we have this technocratic, oligarchic system where governments change, and yet everything in my life remains exactly the same.
Yeah, on that point, I agree. And I mean, I'm only born in 1990 and in Munich, so I really don't think I have a good understanding of what it feels like to have grown up in the East and to have witnessed reunification. But if you just look at the economic facts, it's pretty amazing that we don't talk about this more today. I mean, we all now say, oh, lots of investment is going to the East, so why is everybody so angry? What's the problem? There was one stat that really stood out during my research for the book. It was that 80% of people were temporarily or for a longer period of time unemployed. 80%. And this was like very well-educated people who were engineers and the like, and, you know, had high social standing, had a good job, and suddenly it's like, sorry, your skills are not needed anymore. And to have these kind of experiences, then you have a big promise, exactly what you say, blühende Landschaften is what they said, and that's not really what you see. And then I don't think that 2 or 3 years of more investment can turn that round.
So what kinds of long-term investments can be made in terms of when we're thinking of progressive policy to foster social cohesion and create more economic security?
Well, I mean, there's two things. What do you do every day in politics, and how do you behave or understand? What's your self-understanding as a politician? And I think it's really taking agency back, so not pretending that the state is constantly basically broke and it can only make promises for 6 months. I mean, this is back in, I think, December, when the government thought about capping transmission fees for big companies, and they said they would do it for 6 months because they don't know what the budgetary situation is after that. I mean, come on. Germany is one of the biggest economies in the world. German bonds are, for some odd historical reasons, like the second most demanded asset in the world. And we say, sorry, we don't know beyond 6 months, but you companies, please invest for 20 years. And you people just don't worry about the transition because it's going to be fine. Only that industry changes. So I think this is, you know, getting that back and also saying that you can do it, not pushing away responsibility. I know there's a bit of a balance because you can't fix everything, but this is one of the things that I think I learned in my prior job in the administration is that you are quite good at saying, oh, sorry, we can't do this. We can't be held responsible for this because we really don't know and we can't guarantee you these investments. And obviously the government can. So making these statements, telling people it will be fine, we will do the investments and we will look after the jobs, and decarbonization will be okay. Otherwise, you can't also ask people to, go on that journey with you. I think that's the prerequisite for everything.
So, are there examples in the UK of people being able to push for, advocate for, or make these kinds of changes and demand them of their institutions?
I think there was some hope in some quarters that we would be heading for a Labour government that, if not created a kind of significant break with, New Labour, at least tried to introduce some sort of vague conception of social democracy in the tradition of Labour governments in the past. This is a case where I think the ambition, what could have been the ambition of this government, has actually actively been undermined by vested interests and corporate lobbying and all the sorts of things that we often say only happen in American politics, but are increasingly happening over here. I don't have a great deal of hope that we'll see any significant shifts in terms of public investment from Keir Starmer, because he's trying to make himself into the British Schultz. He has said that the UK is going to create its own set of fiscal rules. And alongside creating fiscal rules, which you can say whatever you like about, you can make more or less flexible fiscal rules. You can make fiscal rules that fit with some level of redistribution. But Starmer has said we are rigidly sticking to these fiscal rules. We are going to create institutions that will mark us on these fiscal rules, and we're not raising any taxes. So effectively, there's a think tank in the UK that said that the Labour Party is effectively lying to people about the promises that it's going to be making. It's saying, we're going to fix the NHS, we're going to fix public services, we're going to boost public investment, we're going to decarbonise, and we're going to do that all without spending any money. How? Economic growth and efficiency savings, and marshalling private investment to kind of deepen the privatization of the NHS that's actually increased costs and created significant inefficiencies. So, I'm not that optimistic about what a Starmer government will do in power. But what I am optimistic about is the capacity of people within the movement, the Labour movement, civil society, to organise and try and hold them to account. I think the more I've kind of seen of politics and engaging in politics and political change, the less hopeful I've become that clever debates about policy and brilliant ideas that are come up with by clever academics will actually shift things. And I've become much more focused on questions of power. Now, I was actually talking to the leader of the Social Democratic group in Finland earlier, and she was saying how when the far right got into coalition and had some power, the first thing they did was crush the unions, crush protest, and try and push back civil society. You've seen exactly the same thing with the Conservatives in the UK. There has been, from an allegedly liberal party, rules that effectively criminalise protest, attack on the Labour unions. And the Labour Party, which was founded by the Labour movement, has not committed to reversing any of this. So for me, when I'm asked what is going to be happening over the course of the next 5 years and where the optimism comes from, I just say it's up to progressives, it's up to the left to make trouble, to build power and to try and hold those in politics to account, because that is what democracy is about. It is about creating accountability. And at the moment, we have too few avenues to be able to actually do that.
And Philippa, what are the prospects in Germany of overcoming this narrative around like a ceiling on your fiscal capacity?
We really have to. I mean, otherwise, I'm not sure how much will be left of the country. I mean, speaking to Grace's point, I mean, I think that we need to go in a similar direction. I mean, you need voters engaged with this, and I think the worst thing that can happen is that economics is basically taken out. I mean, this is kind of rings bells of really, really dark ages in Germany, when it was like there's no alternative, the only thing we can do is austerity, really bad living conditions, and then one guy came in and said, fantastic living conditions, hope, but only for Germans. No, it's really, I mean, that's why I think the Social Democrats have such a crucial role in occupying that ground in politics, because if they don't do it, there's a real risk that some really nasty people will take it. Now, you asked me what do I think is the prospect. I think we need people coming together with some people from kind of more of the inside who help. And to give you a very practical example, so in Germany we have this infamous debt brake in the constitution. Now, the really strange thing about it is that everybody thinks, including very lefty groups, that it puts a quantitative limit on borrowing. And it's simply not true. The big feat is not that someone managed to get this thing into the constitution, that they managed to tell everybody that it is a quantitative limit on borrowing, and there's nothing in there. Basically, the Constitution says you're allowed to borrow 0.35% of GDP every year, plus and minus for if the economy is doing less or is doing poorly or is running strong. That's all the Constitution says. And very clever people have managed to tell the country, this is a fixed limit, and when the limit is at 11.5 billion, it couldn't be any different. There's no way that this constitutional obligation could be fulfilled with 11.7. This is nuts. So I think that's where we need people who work a little bit more on a technical level, even if they don't provide the solution or, the structural power change, but to provide the opening. And that's, why I do the job I do, because I think we need to point this out so that, people can actually come in and see where this whole thing has loose ends.
Yeah, you're right. Like every social democratic shift in history has been based on this alliance between intellectuals and policymakers and then social movements. If you think about, the social democratic shift in the UK, that was Keynesian intellectuals working with the labour movement and, social movements to create this profound shift in British society. And that's really, I think, the only hope that we have, because there are powerful alliances of vested interests in favour of maintaining the status quo, and we need an equal amount of power from below.
And can I just add one real worry? So I'm quite positive that in Germany, we'll get to something, because, there are voters in the street who can think. But what about Europe? Because we don't really have a European constituency. We had European elections, but anybody who's ever campaigned in European elections or tried to explain to people on the street why it's important to vote, and that these people you vote for in the parliament will actually change something, it's incredibly hard. So there, the democratic mechanism is really much harder to establish, and the technocracy is, so much more complicated in between, behind three big walls. Very, very hard to cut through to. So this is my real big worry, and it's very, very abstract things that are decided there, but that have huge structural impact. But to get to that is a whole different ball game, and I don't know whether we can get there fast enough.
So even if there wasn't these kinds of fiscal limits, as Grace pointed out earlier, the state will find ways to find funding for military spending, for international security and foreign policy objectives. And so how would even if there wasn't these kinds of spending limits, would you suggest that social programs can be funded at the same time as these kinds of investments? And what would your response be to critics who say you can't do both? You can't walk and chew gum at the same time, and you also can't invest in foreign policy and social programs?
At the moment, we do a little bit of neither. So, no, to be fair, we have a big defense fund set up, but it's supposed to run out pretty soon, and then it's not clear what comes after that. So Germany is really capable of doing neither, which is even more ironic, because I think we are in a situation where we could do both. Our economy is not running at full capacity. It will also, we probably won't buy the stuff from Germany, or not all of it. So it's not like we're using up the entire labor force to produce tanks, and hence we can't afford to have child carers. Quite the opposite. We have a structural lack of demand, and with the world becoming a nastier place and trade becoming nastier, we need more domestic demand. So more spending is straight up good, as long as it goes into any, semi-sensible, towards any sensible purpose. So I think we in Germany can literally do both. We can have basically, we can have guns and butter, and it's not the trade-off, which may be a lot more difficult in other countries.
Yeah, and similar question to you, Grace. So sometimes when political parties put together their manifestos, they're trying to create a balance sheet, and the kind of investments that are needed in order to build a green economy are huge. There's just no question. And so should that come at the expense of social programs?
I think, the worry I have at the moment is thinking about this changing world that we're seeing. We're seeing this debate in Europe between the kind of, hardcore free marketeers. The Danes and Holland and people who say we need to enforce free markets, and that means really thoroughly enforcing competition, kind of breaking up the monopolies, really being very rigid about state spending. And then there are those who I think are going to win out, who are saying we need to be a bit more, relaxed about this. Perhaps we need to allow the emergence of more monopolies so that they can compete with the ones emerging from China. Maybe we actually need more corporate welfare for the biggest corporations, so that the fossil fuel companies can continue to provide us with cheap electricity. And what I am increasingly seeing, I think, being the shift in Europe is actually towards this kind of corporatist model that you do actually see in the US, which is a big state, right? It's a big state and monopolistic markets where you have this fusion of public and private power in service of vested interests and a kind of fossil fuel military industrial complex. There's a really great example of this happening right now in the US, which is the example of Boeing. This is a massive multinational corporation convicted of defrauding the US government, that was also the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the years that the 737 MAX disasters took place. And then during the pandemic, even after it had been convicted, it received a massive government bailout, tons and tons of money pumped into this organization, which has basically been convicted of kind of institutionalized corruption, and which in an economy where corporate manslaughter actually existed, which it doesn't in US law, should have been convicted of that. And yet, because it's so central to the US's military industrial complex, because it has such close links with other government agencies, with the fossil fuel companies, it is seen as imperative to the interests of the US government that this institution is protected. So actually what I think we're seeing is, the use of the resources that we do have to prop up the interests of corporations that are seen as critical to national security, even when those organizations actively undermine security when it comes to, the material security of people in that country, and also the security of the climate over the longer term. There's, again, such hypocrisy around this as well when we think about the allies that we choose and the relationship between those alliances and energy policy. The West has spent years making friends with incredibly corrupt dictators all around the world in exchange for fossil fuels. The UK, for example, has this alliance with Saudi Arabia that is basically mediated by BAE Systems, the massive multinational arms company. The Saudis send oil, and in return, they get weapons from BAE. And this was actually the source of, one of the largest and most corrupt arms deals in history, which was supported and facilitated by Mark Thatcher, the son of Margaret Thatcher. So there is this kind of institutionalized corruption at the top of the economy that knits together the interests of security, the fossil fuel industry, and certain sectors of the state. And if the far right comes to power, it will feed into that. There will be cuts to social welfare and big increases in corporate welfare to the fossil fuel companies, which, by the way, are some of the biggest recipients of corporate welfare in the world. So my concern is less about undermining this narrative of fiscal responsibility. That is a big concern because it is used as a weapon to beat up the left. But it's more about exposing the way that state power is used. And it is consistently used to prop up the interests of those at the top. And the only counter to that, it can't just be the state needs to spend more money. It has to be the state has to be accountable to its citizens. And actually, the only way that we're going to win that is if citizens demand it. And to do that, we have to get organized.
Maybe to make a short plug for your book, I think it's really interesting on that aspect. No, I mean, Grace writes about markets and planning, capitalism planning not being opposite, or planning not meaning that we don't have capitalism. They can go together very, very well, and can even feed into each other. And I think this is a really, really interesting point, and one that's extremely relevant for today. Especially for those who think that active industrial policy is important. And I count myself amongst those, but we have to deal with this problem. I mean, you named the case of Boeing, but in Germany we have a big car industry that produces, very large, very expensive cars, still likes combustion engines a lot. A lot of money going into that. The reason why we have that industry in that way, I think, is because we subsidize corporate cars a lot, which, I mean, distributionally, from a climate perspective, it's all pretty problematic. But we do it because it provides good jobs. And we've had that industrial policy for a while, and it's not necessarily been the most forward-looking. So I think this is really one of the examples that we all have to grapple with and explain why future industrial policy would be different from, preserving business models that will have quite a big problem in the future. So it's not even securing jobs for the future. Still, no politician can afford to or dares to, do something about this, because even an unskilled worker in the car industry gets about 21 euros an hour, which is an excellent wage. So we really have to answer that question. But that's also where, then I do have questions when it comes to your book, because your answer is essentially democracy, right? And more power from bottom up, and that's how you guard against vested interests. But how does industrial policy work when you have that, especially when, I get that you don't like big companies and big conglomerates, but we are facing the US and we are facing China. I would love it if we'd managed to make service sector, and especially social service sector jobs, good jobs, but we haven't. The really good jobs are in industry, they are in these big companies. So how will we do industrial policy in a bottom-up democratic way?
Well, it's not actually true that I don't like all big companies. I'm very happy with big companies if they're worker-owned and democratically run. And the opposite example to Boeing, and the one I use in the book, is Lucas Aerospace in the UK. This was an example in the 70s of a bunch of workers that basically came together and tried to take over their company because it was declining in competitiveness respective to the rest of the world. They wanted a bailout. The state said we couldn't give it to them. So instead, they tried this radical alternative, which was the workers took over, tried to take over the company, and instead of producing weapons, decided we don't want to produce weapons. We want to produce socially useful technologies. So developed this plan to say we're going to produce wind turbines and kidney dialysis machines and all of these exciting things. Now, unsurprisingly, despite the fact that this was, this is like the epitome of freedom in many ways. Like, if you are really a liberal, this is something that you should, think very seriously about. It's like cooperative movements, employee ownership, all these sorts of things, because they make real the promise of freedom. But Thatcher came in and crushed that attempt. And instead, Lucas Aerospace was broken up. And part of what was once Lucas Aerospace became part of United Technologies in the US, which manufactured the faulty sensors in the Boeing 737 MAX that ultimately led to it crashing and killing nearly 350 people. And I feel like that is the kind of the divide that we face, right? It's not between like big government and small government, or big companies and small companies. It is literally a question of democratic accountability across the board. So if we do industrial policy, how can that be a process that engages all of civil society, and through which, people are able to actually feed into that and say, not just industrial policy from the top down, but industrial policy for my place, for my region. There's something going on in the UK called the Community Wealth Building Movement, which is about how local authorities use their purchasing power to support local cooperatives, to support businesses with kind of ethical standards, and keep work and jobs in the local area. That is just as much industrial policy, I would argue, as, do we give money to Siemens or whoever else at the level of the EU?
So I think there's going to be time to go for some questions. So if you have any questions, put up your hand. And we have great people with microphones who will come. And if not, I have some questions. Oh, we have one right here.
Thank you. It's mainly directed to Grace, but obviously, Philippa, I'm also interested in your point of view. It seems like you're quite, let's say, critical towards the Schwarze Null, and I'd be interested why that is the case and what you would want instead.
Why do I not like the Schwarze Null? I certainly don't. There's lots of reasons for that. I'm going to give you the economist's reason, and then I'm going to give you the socialist's reason. So the economist's reason is that it makes absolutely zero sense to try and limit primary deficits over a short period of time. What you really should be aiming to do if you're thinking about creating a kind of productive economy that has sustainable public finances over the long term is trying to, use fiscal and monetary policy to like minimize the output gap. So to make sure that society's resources are being used in the most effective way, in a way that isn't leading to inflation, and in a way that is laying the foundations for future economic growth. So if that means there's a recession and you need to invest in, new rail networks that are going to create opportunities for businesses tomorrow, then you do that because it also creates employment today, reduces the deficit, and kind of make sure that you're operating closer, with a smaller output gap. And we've seen this in the UK, the fact that you've had constant austerity. Even when interest rates were really low, you had cuts to loads of areas of state spending. It's devastated our competitiveness as an economy, along with Brexit. It means that we have, poor, not just physical, but also social infrastructure. It means that our public services aren't working properly, that a record number of people are now sick, off work, and unable to work because of mental or physical health issues. It means that our public services are falling apart in lots of different ways. And it's undermined the productive foundations of the economy, as well as giving us low wages, low productivity, low growth for a very long time. So even just on a very kind of basic economics-y technical level, I don't think it works. You need to have much more flexibility, as I'm sure Philippa will be able to argue. But my personal issue with it has less to do with that and more to do with the fact that it is an ideology that is used to, as I've said, basically wage class war. It's not really, this idea of fiscal austerity is always used as a means of denying working people the basic services that they need to survive. There's always enough money when you have to pay for a war or a bailout for a big business or a tax break for the rich, right? The state is very big for some people and it's very small for other people. And I think the whole idea of fiscal responsibility, Thatcher said, it's because the economy of the nation is like the economy of a household budget. And you have to make sure that your spending is maintained at certain levels. So does the government. It was a very powerful ideological tool that encouraged people to think that, Thatcher and the Conservatives and anyone who adopted this mantle of fiscal austerity would behave responsibly. But actually, they haven't. This hasn't neoliberalism hasn't shrunk the state in most places. It's just shifted who gets to benefit from state spending. And I actually think that that's what it's done pretty much everywhere.
Philippa.
No, not much to add. I think it tells you something that the Black Zero was never something that came out of even a technocratic process. It was in Germany, it was the final celebration of an ideology because one had already put the strictest possible rule into the constitution, so there's not much more you can do after that to prove how austere you are. So then you need to put Black Zero in a Twitter image and send it to the world and officially claim it's your fetish. Very little to do with economics, and maybe just briefly because you touched on fiscal responsibility, and I think sometimes the left makes the mistake of saying, well, fiscal responsibility doesn't matter. No, the question is, what is fiscal responsibility? So when we talk about the government and having its money in order, what does that mean, and what are the preconditions for that? And the most important thing is that your economy is in order and that people earn good money. Because if people earn good money, they will pay taxes and they won't have to be subsidized by the state. And since as a state, the general assumption is that you live for quite a while, it's quite good to not only make sure that people have a good job today, but to also lay the foundations that the next generation has a good education so they can have a job and there are companies around. So when you start to think about it in those terms, balancing the budget every year, which is probably not even how a Späti would run its business, is maybe not an excellent idea.
All right, let's take another question. There was hands up over here.
Thank you. Thank you for the great discussion. This might be a large question. It's definitely on this summit. Why is the left losing as much popular ground as it is lately when we're experiencing an increase in inequality, ever richer and smaller elites? We're not experiencing a major cultural shock like 2015 was. Why is the left no longer the anti-elitist party of the small man?
That's the question. Who would like to take it first?
I'm not sure that electoral success for at least Social Democrats necessarily goes with being anti-elite. I think in Germany that would cost us 2/3 of our votes, which may or may not be a good thing. But to answer your first question of, how come we're in trouble and not benefiting from this general pretty broad skepticism, and I mean, I think we're probably a similar age. I studied in 2008 to 2011, so financial crisis was in the middle of it, and this is probably the reason of why I have the thoughts that I have. Before that, I was quite convinced that markets were excellent and freedom optimizing, and after that, I had second thoughts. And so, how come the left can't capitalize on that when we've seen that markets are so faulty? I think we haven't managed to explain to people, and maybe we are not yet. All of us convinced ourselves that there is actually agency to change something. But this is what you credibly need to explain, right? You need to say why the world could be different and how it could be different. There was an earlier panel here where it was a lot about, specific small policies that you could change and you could make the world better, but you couldn't really see how the big picture was changing, how power could structurally shift. And I think this is, the big question everybody's asking themselves: how can we shift power? So we need a good explanation of how we can get agency back. This, I think, we too also have a slightly different view. I think that politicians need to take it back. When you are a finance minister or a chancellor, you have a lot of power. So change these rules, spend the money, run the economy at full steam, make sure you have good wages, nothing standing in the way. I think you think it needs a more bottom-up movement, but that's why I think we need to credibly explain this to the public, and that first prerequisite is that we ourselves are convinced that this is the way.
I'm going to take your question and make it even broader and say, if you look at kind of polling in most societies, actually, crazily enough now, even the US, most people say that they don't support capitalism. They say that they don't think that the current economic model is working. So why does capitalism continue? This is a question that I'm looking at in my next book, actually. And the three major reasons at a global level are violence, apartheid, and individualism. If you look at the world economy, we've been told now that, like in the West, we don't have capitalism anymore because we don't have a working class, because everyone's middle class now, and the rest of the world is eventually going to catch up and everyone's going to be middle class. That's not what happened. Obviously, it's that production is now centered in very poor countries. That's where the global working class lives. In rich countries, we've created a professional managerial class whose job it is to manage a globalized production process in accounting, finance, marketing, whatever, and a service sector that caters to their needs. So the ownership and management of resources is centered in the global north, and production is centered in the global south. That system is maintained through violence and apartheid. If you are a working class person in the global south and you try and go on strike, you'll probably be shot at. And why do we not have class conflict in the UK, say, in the same way that we did in the 1850s? Well, it's because in the 1850s, capitalists and workers both lived in the UK and literally fought each other in the factories, whereas now they are separated through this international division of labor. So those are all global things. But when we look at our own societies, I think the biggest thing is individualism. We used to live in a world where the example I like to give, the cost of living crisis 50 years ago, if you realized that you couldn't pay your rent and you couldn't put food on the table, you would have turned up to work, asked your co-workers if they were also experiencing the same issue, and then said, right, we need to organize to demand a higher wage from our boss, and if he doesn't give it to us, we'll go on strike. Today, if you can't afford to put food on the table, you will blame yourself, feel like a loser, maybe take out a payday loan, and force yourself into debt and feel like that problem is singularly yours. It's your individual responsibility, and there's no way you could imagine cooperating with other people to try and change that. That ideological shift is, I think, why the left hasn't been able to take advantage of the decline in living standards that we've seen, and it's why the far right has been able to take advantage of that, because the far right response to it is highly individualistic. It's, you are angry, the elites have screwed you over, so we are going to make you feel powerful by crushing migrants, crushing benefit scroungers, crushing the left, crushing anyone who threatens your position in society. And that's the response to that issue. Whereas the response of the left has always been, we have to organize and work together to push back against this this system that is harming your interests in so many ways. And the thing that stands in the way of that now is just the sense that we are all isolated, atomized individuals who couldn't possibly come together and change things, and instead have to rely entirely on our own selves. And that is, I think, something that has become even worse in the age of TikTok and social media and the entrepreneurship of the self. So that, I think, ideological shift is really where we need to begin. We need to give people a taste of collective action. Because when you get that and you experience the sense of belonging that comes from organizing with people to try and make the world a better place, it is a very addictive thing. And I think that is the foundation of the change we need to see.
All right, some more hands.
Thank you both, first of all, for this very exciting discussion that you're already having. Thank you also for the perspective. But this question is more related also to the other talks that we're seeing today. And I was wondering about, the largest group is maybe missing on the table. Still the trade unions are the largest organization in Germany, larger than all the other parties, larger than all the parties together. But still, and maybe there are people in the audience which are related to the trade unions, please talk to me later. I would be really happy about that. But I don't, they're not very prominent on this summit, for example, but also maybe not so much in this debate. So maybe you can elaborate or discuss maybe a little bit on your perspectives on why that is and how this might be changed.
I do think that the trade unions have been quite prominent in Germany actually recently, and we got those strikes.
Yeah.
Everybody again is using Deutsche Bahn noise. They were quite intense strikes. I think that unions in Germany are facing the same difficulties as in other countries. They were not as strong as they used to be, and this is where we do actually get to structural problems. German unions for some time were at least quite good at also practicing wage restraint or enforcing that, because you want to make sure that production stays here, but then you become less attractive. What do you do? It's incredibly hard in a globalized system with a globalized capital that can move very, very quickly. So there, I think there's a structural issue, but the unions have been present. But I think the much bigger issue for the unions right now, and I think this will determine a lot of their role in going forward, is will they manage to keep the struggle for good working conditions, good pay, and decarbonization together. And this is what's really, really tough in Germany, and where we can also see some slight differences.
Yeah, labor unions in many parts of the world have been facing a kind of existential threat in recent years, particularly in places like the UK, where union membership was just on a constantly downwards trajectory until a few years ago. If I think about the biggest challenges facing unions, aside from the big structural ones that we've already talked about, and aside from the kind of ideological ones as well, because part of the reason people don't join unions is because of this individualism that's like, I want a wage increase, I need to work harder rather than I need to demand one from my boss. But the other ones are, similar things we've been talking about for ages. How do you unionize in the services sector? How do you create a model of union organizing that is kind of dynamic and responsive to the needs of workers that aren't all together in one factory, which has been a problem for unionists for a long time. But I am kind of encouraged by some of the stuff that is coming out in terms of organizing in the new economy. So gig economy workers, for example, have been making efforts for quite a long time in the UK to organize Deliveroo drivers, etc. And in doing so, they are not only kind of pioneering new models of organizing. It's actually a fascinating book written about this, about how, because so many workers in Deliveroo in London came from Brazil, they imported kind of Brazilian models of trade union organizing into the UK, which supported the organizing efforts there, which was really fascinating. But also thinking about kind of structural changes to the economy. So there's a big movement around workers in the gig economy towards cooperative worker-owned apps. You don't need an Uber. Uber is, it controls you. You don't need Deliveroo or whatever. It controls you. It controls your labor. And actually, there are versions of these apps already that are worker-owned, owned by and run by unions, where they all kind of feed into knowing how the algorithm works, and they all profit from it. So kind of those new models of organizing, I think, are particularly exciting. And the other big challenge is literally what you just said. How are we going to square unions who legitimately have to represent the interests of their members, many of whom work in polluting industries, with the need to decarbonize. And that is, I think, an issue that has as yet not been solved. And it will only, I think, be solved when the interests of those workers are kind of listened to in the same way as the interests of the fossil fuel companies. Because if that was the case, then we would have a plan for decarbonization that also facilitated full employment at the same time. And yeah, we don't.
There's some more hands. Yeah. Oh, we'll take the one in the back first, and then you can be second. All right, no, you're in the right spot. Yes, sorry.
I'm the one in the back. Great, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you all for the panel. Grace, thank you for your research in 2019, 2020. I used it for my thesis on neoliberalism and uncertainty.
Cool.
So very much appreciated. And Philippa and Jen, hope to encounter yours soon. Yeah, I guess this is about uncertainty and neoliberalism. And I think we haven't really talked about championing change in times of uncertainty. We've talked about the progressive a lot today. I'd like to hear a bit more about uncertainty in terms of narrative, because I think a lot of what you talked about, Grace and Philippa, is like the narrative of this is an idea about the 60% or the Schwarze Null, right? That is taken to be certain and is taken to be concrete and is taken to be something that makes sense, but that's actually just BS, right? And what are we trying to see as a bit more honest approach to encountering uncertainty now, when we realize the stuff that we thought was certain and taken for granted isn't necessarily so. So, to you.
I mean, I think there's one thing that the state can, or politicians can really do if they want to generally reduce uncertainty. I mean, where's the big uncertainty coming from? I agree, it's climate, and it's this extremely fast speed at which we have to transform our economies, which is really kind of breathtaking if you think about how much has to change in how short a time. And now I think governments are the only ones who can actually, generally take out uncertainty, because they can tell you what, the transformation path for the energy system, for instance, is. I mean, there's some things we really don't know, but quite a lot of things that are knowable by the actor who does the thing. And transmission lines, for instance, I mean, they are planned by the state in collaboration with 3 companies. They can know what happens in the next 20 years. So if the state took a bit more of a leading role there, also told people what the market would look like in 10, 15 years, it would be a lot easier for companies to make their investments. So I think that's one that you can really do. And then the second one, I mean, thinking more about people, I think uncertainty is a lot easier to deal with when it doesn't affect the things that you really need to survive. Now, we are in a very, very fortunate position. We're a very wealthy country. We can actually make sure that everybody has enough to get by. I spent some time in Liberia and West Africa, where you don't have basic healthcare services, all of that. You generally, as government, you can't make that promise. It's pretty crappy to stand in front of people and admit that. Here, we don't need to. We can. So I think being really firm on that, and also not when the economy has a slight blip, say, sorry, we don't know whether we can afford social security. No, we can. And we will absolutely make sure this happens. And these are kind of the conditions under which I think the economy is transforming. If the government could already, in a convincing way, say that, we would be in a slightly different place.
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add. I think we know that capitalist economies, market economies in general, aren't very good at dealing with uncertainty, and you see this in the green transition in particular. We have this whole idea of the Keynesian theory of the two-price theory. So when you're thinking about business investment, you as an investor in whatever, you're not. When you're making that investment decision, you are basing it on the costs of things today and a prediction about the profits that you'll have tomorrow. And mainstream theory kind of strips out this point about prediction and uncertainty, which is made based on emotion, Keynes says, but also, what are the other ways that businesses use to kind of deal with and remove uncertainty? They, make sure that they're lobbying governments and they have the ear of governments. They make often kind of covert alliances with other competitors in the area. They buy up their competitors. They have strong alliances with financial institutions that can support them through periods of uncertainty. This problem of uncertainty in investment tends to, create a drive towards security for a business, and it does that in a lot of different political as well as economic ways. This also kind of is very obvious in the divides that you see between the future strategy of fossil fuel companies, say, and the future strategy of renewable companies. Brett Christophers has done some really interesting work looking at why it's so hard to decarbonize the energy system, the electricity system in particular, when costs have been falling. And the issue is that there's not as much profit to be made in renewables. At the same time, government is basically guaranteeing the profits of big fossil fuel companies by saying, oh, if you need to decommission a bunch of oil platforms in the North Sea, we'll basically let you completely write it off against tax, or literally giving them subsidies in a lot of other places. So, how do we shift that balance? It does, as you've said, have to come down to the role of, big institutions that can coordinate that spending. And that is, I think, where the state, needs to play a role.
So I think we have one more question. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. There has been a lot of talk lately among European governments about the so-called war economy. And we actually had a panel earlier in which it would actually seem that there's a consensus, even among progressive political elites, that we actually need to do that. However, it is quite obvious that structuring European economies towards this kind of model would ultimately shift money from welfare, from social security, from education, health, towards other areas of spending, which would also create a structural, long-term orientation of our European economies. How do you see this war economy discussion?
I think we have kind of gotten so wrapped up in a technocratic construct, which is awful for many reasons, but that we also won't be able to do this. I mean, how is Europe going to do any big spending on anything and have any big structural shifts in the next coming years? Europe has just agreed to lower debt to GDP ratios in the coming years. I mean, this is the fiscal rule that stands for everybody. We have rising costs of aging. We have rising financing costs. So basically, everybody needs to cut everything. So I don't really see how governments can lead any structural change, also not in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, if we're thinking about long-term security, then they're fighting the wrong wars. Like, there needs to be a war economy in the war against climate breakdown. And that doesn't exist and is not going to exist because climate breakdown isn't seen as a security threat in the same way that, very, near-term security threats are. And that is a real problem, not just because, climate breakdown is this big security threat for us, but also because we're basically kind of tiptoeing into a world of climate apartheid, where we build up walls around Europe and the West and watch as, large swathes of the planet become uninhabitable and millions of people are displaced and bump up against these walls and are, drowned in the Mediterranean or whatever. One statistic that I thought was amazing was that the European Union has constructed 1,800 kilometers of border walls and fences, which is the equivalent of about 11 Berlin walls in the period since the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is what the freedom of capitalism has brought us. It is this world that is divided between people who are potentially going to be somewhat protected from the effects of climate breakdown and everyone else. So that is the war, if you want to call it that, and it's going to create potentially a lot of wars. So, yeah, we need to be spending money on decarbonization. I don't know how much clearer that is, but obviously it's not going to happen unless we really start to demand it from our governments. So that's what I'm going to be doing with the Labour Party for the next 4 years, is just making lots of trouble to try and force them to realize that this is important.
And the final word is, how can we as the audience stay in contact with your work and read your writings, especially over the troublemaking 4 years?
You can find me on all good social media platforms at Grace Blakely. And if you would like to, you can also purchase my book, which will be out in German with Tropenverlag in September. Apologies for my terrible German. And which you can also buy in English in any good bookstore now.
And Philippa?
All right, book is out end of September. It's called Gutes Geld, Good Money. And it's supposed to be really accessible. You all can tell me then that is not true, but there are also some funny drawings in there. So hopefully, we get to laugh a little bit about the debt break. Not saying any more than that. And other than that, Dezernat Zukunft.org is our German think tank, and then the European Macro Policy Network for everybody who looks beyond Germany and wants Europe to actually get some agency back.
Well, thank you, and let's give a nice round of applause. This was a great panel.
Great. All right. Thank you to our great panel, all-female panel. It was a wonderful conversation to listen to you. And it's 7 p.m., what means that we have arrived at the end, at the final station of the day program, but the event continues. And I would like to cordially welcome you to the PGS 2024 Midsummer Reception. Right now we will have a 30 minutes break, and we will continue in a bigger community, in a bigger circles at 7:30. I'll just let you know what's coming up. So from now on, we will be only meeting here at the main stage, and at 7:30, the Midsummer Reception kicks off with some welcoming words and a transatlantic talk. Then we will talk a lot about football and politics, because it's impossible to ignore that there's also another international event taking place today in Berlin. Just saying. And then at 8:15, dinner will be served. And here an important announcement. You would have to purchase bar tokens for food and drinks. They are available on 2 stations in foyer to have some snacks and drinks. And then at 9, we all invite you to watch the France-Netherlands game, which is taking place now. Right now, Poland and Austria is playing 1-1, if anybody was interested. All right, so see you again here at the main stage at 7:30. Thank you very much. And thank you.